At 01:50 on the night of December 19 in the year 1944, Private First Class Harry Miller crouched low inside the loader position of a Sherman tank near Stoumont Station in Belgium. He stared at the fog-filled road ahead where German Panther tanks were expected to appear before another hour passed. He was only 18 years old. He had never fought in real battle. He had never destroyed an enemy tank. In the last 72 hours, the battle group led by Piper had smashed through the Ardennes with 58 panzers and 5,000 SS troops. They had broken 3 American divisions with frightening speed. Miller still had grease on his hands from working through the night trying to make his tank operate. Just 18 hours earlier, the 740th Tank Battalion had owned exactly 0 working tanks. Lieutenant Colonel George Rubel and his daredevils had trained for 18 months in Arizona as a special searchlight unit. That mission had been cancelled in the month of November. First Army told them new M4 Shermans would arrive by the month of January in the year 1945. Instead, they had been given only 9 borrowed tanks to train with. On December 16, the Germans attacked in full force. On December 17, First Army ordered those 9 borrowed tanks handed over to another unit. That left Rubel with nothing but 3 light M5 Stuart tanks and 2 assault guns. They had no medium tanks at all and no real chance to slow down German armor. Then someone at headquarters remembered the depot at Spremont. At 12:45 in the afternoon of December 18, new orders arrived for the daredevils. Move to Spremont. Take whatever vehicles could be found. Repair them if possible. That was their only hope. At 1400 hours, Captain James Barry led Company C toward the depot. Miller followed behind with every mechanic available to the battalion. What they discovered shocked every man present. 3 tanks sat lined up as if ready for action, yet each one was missing critical parts. 25 more vehicles lay scattered across the yard. Some were burned out. Some had been stripped for parts. Some looked like hulks dragged from earlier battles. The personnel at the depot had evacuated so fast they had left meals half-eaten on tables inside the mess hall. Miller drew a duplex-drive Sherman meant for amphibious operations. It had no breech block. It had no machine guns. It had no radio. Staff Sergeant Charlie Luppy claimed an M36 tank destroyer, though he had never trained on one in his life. 2 M24 Chaffee light tanks were soon discovered as well. No one in the battalion had ever used a Chaffee. None of that mattered now. The men began repairs at once. Through the entire night, Miller and his crew scoured the muddy salvage yard, pulling parts from wrecked vehicles. They found a breech block on a burned-out Sherman. They took machine guns from a broken half-track with a shattered suspension. They made their tank speak by force of will. By 0200 on December 1903, Shermans and the M36 could move, and they could fire, though barely. The radio inside Miller's tank hissed with static. The traverse system on the main gun leaked hydraulic fluid. The ammunition looked old with faded markings, yet orders had arrived 30 minutes earlier. Move to Stoumont Station at once. Piper had broken through 12 miles west. Headquarters of First Army at Spa prepared to evacuate. Battle Group Piper was now only 1 bridge away from entering open roads that led straight to the Meuse River. If Piper reached that river, he would split Allied forces in half. The British and the Canadians to the north would be cut off. Eisenhower faced disaster. Only one thing slowed Piper. His tanks burned fuel faster than supply trucks could haul it to them. Allied reports warned that fuel convoys were on the way from Germany. If those convoys arrived, nothing would stop the SS thrust, except the small American units still holding the Ambelv River Valley. At Stoumont, the 1st Battalion of the 119th Infantry Regiment had dug foxholes through the previous day. These riflemen knew a heavy German attack was coming, though none knew the exact hour. 8 3-inch towed guns from the 876th Tank Destroyer Battalion waited along the road. All listened to the silence inside the freezing fog. Engines could not be heard, yet everyone sensed they were coming. At 0700 on December 19, German paratroopers and SS Panzer Grenadiers stormed Stumont village 2 miles east of the station. Several Tiger tanks advanced with them. The 3rd Battalion of the 119th fought through every street and every doorway. By noon, Piper held the village. Major General Leland Hobbs, who commanded the 30th Division, now saw his position slipping away. His 119th Infantry had lost the last strong location in the valley. Only the thin and tired 1st Battalion remained at the station. If they failed, Piper would reach Liege before the next night. Miller waited for the order that would decide everything. The fog still clung to the valley. His hands, still dark with grease, gripped the cold metal inside the tank. He sat in a machine held together by scraps torn from ruined vehicles. Yet this machine stood between Piper and disaster for the Allied army. 3 junk tanks built in one desperate night were now all that stood in the path of 58 panzers, led by one of the most feared officers in the German SS. Miller climbed into his Sherman at 0300 on that bitter morning. The engine coughed once, then rumbled awake on the second attempt. The radio flickered with a weak signal, yet it worked. The main gun traverse moved when he tested it, though sluggish and uneven. He had never fired this tank in real combat. He had never driven this exact machine before. The sights had not been calibrated since the day the tank had been abandoned at the depot. None of that mattered anymore. Lieutenant Charles Powers was already assembling 3rd Platoon. By 0345, the small column rolled down the Amble Valley Road with Miller's Sherman taking the 4th slot. Somewhere in the fog ahead, 3 Panthers waited like ghosts. Miller had 30 minutes to learn whether 3 patched-together Shermans built in a single night could stop the strongest armor Nazi Germany had left. The road that hugged the Amble River barely held the width of one Sherman. On the left, a steep wall of woods rose more than 300 feet. On the right, the river ran roughly 40 feet across with a deep, swift current too strong to ford. There was one road, one direction. No room for flanking maneuvers. The fog pressed so thick that visibility shrank to 75 yards. The temperature sat at 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice gathered on every exposed surface. Inside the lead tank, Lieutenant Powers stood nearly upright in his turret, with his head above the cupola. He watched the grey wall ahead as if willing shapes to appear. His driver inched the tank forward at a slow walk. Miller's driver sat beside him, gripping the controls with so much tension that the skin across his knuckles had turned bright white. This driver had arrived from Ohio only 6 days prior. He had never fired the main gun in battle. The only Panthers he had seen were printed in recognition pamphlets. The platoon advanced slowly 400 yards, then 500. Nothing moved, only the hum of engines and the echo of sound bouncing from the stone and timber walls of the valley. Dawn drew closer. At 0600 the fog lightened, but only slightly. Powers estimated that he could see no more than 100 yards ahead. The road curved right around a rocky outcrop. Past that bend stood Stumont Station, the old granite rail building that controlled the valley approach. Powers guided his Sherman around the curve, then he froze. A Panther sat directly ahead at 100 yards distance. Branches and brush covered its hull and turret like camouflage netting. Its long 75mm gun pointed straight down the road. The German crew had chosen the perfect spot. They could fire at anything approaching while remaining hull down with only their turret exposed. Any Sherman that moved forward would need to show its entire front plate before even taking aim. Yet the German gunner never fired. Corporal Jack Ashby, the gunner in Powers' Sherman, reacted first. He fired a single armor-piercing round. The shell slammed into the Panther's gun mantlet at a near-perfect perpendicular angle. It deflected downward and tore into the driver's compartment. Flames burst from the tank. Secondary explosions rippled through the turret as ammunition cooked off. 4 German crewmen scrambled out. 2 burned as they fell onto the ground. Powers pushed ahead. Miller traversed his gun left to cover the woods where the survivors ran for cover. The column moved another 150 yards past the burning tank. At 06:15, Powers spotted another Panther on the left side of the road. This one was hull down behind a heavy stone wall. The crew of this second Panther had watched their partner die. They were ready. Ashby fired again. The armor-piercing shell struck the lower front slope of the Panther at a shallow angle and skipped off, leaving a deep gouge but no penetration. The German turret began to swing toward Powers. At that exact moment, Ashby yelled that the gun was jammed. A spent shell casing had caught at an angle and wedged itself in the breach. Powers could do nothing. The Panther's gun kept turning. From third position, Staff Sergeant Charlie Luppy's M36 tank destroyer lurched forward. Luppy had found this machine at the depot only 18 hours earlier and had never used a 90mm gun in his life. His gunner, Corporal William Beckman, had never aimed one in combat. Yet they now had 3 seconds before the Panther's gun aligned and fired. Beckman steadied his breathing. He aimed. Then he pulled the trigger. The 90mm round flew straight and punched through the Panther's front plate like thin wood. Beckman fired again almost immediately. The second round hit the turret ring. He fired one more time. The third round struck the ammunition racks. The Panther erupted in an explosion so violent that the turret lifted 6 feet off the hull before crashing back down crooked and broken. No one from the German crew survived. Powers' men cleared the jam in their own gun. Powers regained the lead and continued advancing another 150 yards through thick fog. At 0630, with daylight finally pushing through the valley, he saw the third Panther waiting on the right side. The crew had hidden their machine inside a farmyard behind another low stone wall. Only the barrel and part of the upper glacis showed. Ashby fired once more. The shell met the Panther's muzzle brake dead center. The brake shattered. The shell kept going down the barrel and detonated inside the gun tube. The blast peeled the metal outward like petals on an iron flower. The German crew instantly abandoned their tank. It could no longer fire, it could no longer fight. At 0635, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Herlong, who commanded the 1st Battalion of the 119th Infantry, ordered the attack halted. In exactly 30 minutes, Company C had retaken Stumont Station. 3 Panthers had been destroyed by 3 junkyard Shermans and a borrowed tank destroyer. Piper's advance through the Amble Valley, stopped like it, had run into a stone wall. But Miller knew this was only the beginning. Piper still had 55 operational tanks waiting in Stumont Village 2 miles ahead. Fuel convoys moved toward him from Germany. At dawn on December 20th, the SS would counterattack with everything they could muster. Miller and his battered Sherman would have to face them. The final shot from Beckman's 90mm cannon still echoed through the valley when the shattered Panther settled back onto its hull. The turret rested at a crooked angle as smoke poured out of the wreck. Flames licked through the open hatches. The blast had killed every man inside instantly. Powers signaled the platoon forward again. The jam in his own gun had been cleared, and the 3rd platoon regained formation with Powers in front. Miller followed in his Sherman, feeling the weight of exhaustion and adrenaline blend into one steady force that pushed him on. They had advanced another 150 yards through thinning fog when daylight finally began to press into the valley. At 0630, Powers spotted the 3rd Panther. This one lay concealed on the right side of the road in a farmyard behind a low stone wall. Only part of the gun tube and a section of upper armor showed through the fog. Ashby fired without hesitation. His armor-piercing round struck the Panther's muzzle brake with deadly accuracy. The brake shattered into flying fragments. The shell continued through the barrel until it detonated deep inside the gun tube. The resulting blast ripped the barrel outward like metal petals pried open by invisible hands. The German crew saw the ruined weapon and knew their tank was finished. They bailed out and ran for cover, leaving the crippled machine behind. Their Panther could not fire another round. At 0635, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Herlong, commanding 1st Battalion of the 119th Infantry, halted the advance. The valley fell silent except for the crackling flames from the destroyed Panthers. In exactly 30 minutes, Company C had retaken Stumont Station. 3 Panthers had been eliminated by 3 makeshift Shermans and 1 borrowed tank destroyer. Piper's drive into the Amble Valley had been stopped cold. Yet Miller knew the victory was only a moment of breath inside a far larger fight. Piper still commanded 55 operational tanks waiting in Stumont Village 2 miles to the east. Fuel convoys from Germany were trying to reach him. If they succeeded, the battle would ignite again with savage force. The daredevils would have to hold no matter what came next. That night Miller stayed inside his Sherman at Stumont Station. He curled himself near the ready rack like a dog seeking warmth in a metal den. The temperature dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice formed along the turret interior. Every exposed surface stung bare skin like fire. Sleep refused to come. Miller huddled close to the loader to share body heat. Outside, the darkness glowed red through the fog, where the 3 burning Panthers continued to spit ammunition and sparks as their internal stores cooked off. Each sharp pop echoed along the cliffs with unnerving sharpness. More tanks arrived from Spremont Depot after midnight. Mechanics worked by flashlight with tools cold enough to stick to skin. They installed functioning radios. They calibrated gun sights. They patched leaks and replaced parts until the vehicles could fight again. Fuel trucks arrived and backed into position. Ammunition handlers formed chains to pass shells up through turret hatches one by one. The rows of heavy explosive rounds built like towers inside the Shermans. Artillery crews from the 30th Division moved their guns forward into frozen ground and dug shallow positions. By dawn on December 20th, Company C possessed 14 operational Shermans. It was nowhere near Piper's 55 tanks, yet it was enough to make him bleed for every yard. The morning remained brutal. Rain mixed with sleet. Fog hung low and heavy, cutting visibility to 100 yards. At 602nd Platoon, led by 1st Lieutenant John Calloway, advanced to begin the morning push. Infantry from 1st Battalion walked through the woods on both sides to provide flank support. Behind them, artillery prepared to fire as soon as targets appeared. The objective was Stumont Village, 2 miles ahead, where Piper had concentrated his remaining strength. Calloway's Sherman moved with deliberate caution. Every stone wall offered a hiding place. Every barn could shelter a panther. The fog twisted shapes into illusions. The road sloped upward away from the Amble and led into terrain built for defenders. Calloway expected trouble at every bend. At 6:20 trouble arrived. A panther sat hull down behind a heavy stone wall. Only the turret and gun showed. The panther's long barrel pointed down the road toward the advancing Shermans. Calloway's gunner took aim immediately. The armor-piercing shell struck cleanly at the muzzle brake and dove through the barrel. A violent detonation followed, and the barrel peeled open into steel petals. The German crew abandoned their wrecked tank at once. 2nd Platoon pressed forward and soon destroyed 2 SS half-tracks that attempted to withdraw along a narrow lane. But at 0640, Staff Sergeant Homer Tompkins' Sherman rolled into a minefield that the SS had prepared during the night. The first mine exploded beneath the left track, sending 18 track links flying into the air. Before Tompkins could stop the vehicle, the second mine detonated beneath the right track. Both tracks tore away completely. The Sherman froze in the center of the road, blocking the entire advance. Almost instantly, German MG-42 machine guns opened fire. Bullets tore across the road and ripped into the earth near the disabled tank. The SS had clearly prepared this field as a kill zone. Tompkins popped his turret hatch and scanned for cover as rounds snapped through the air. He yelled for his crew to escape. The driver kicked open the bottom escape hatch and dropped into the ditch. The gunner followed. The loader scrambled after him. Finally, Tompkins dropped from the turret and sprinted through flying snow as bullets clawed at the ground around his feet. By some miracle, all 5 men survived without a single wound. Yet their tank now blocked the narrow road and halted the entire attack. By noon, the American forces captured the hamlet of Targnon after brutal house-to-house fighting. Miller's Sherman provided covering fire from behind a stone barn. High explosive rounds soared into suspected German positions. The heat inside the tank grew unbearable even though the outside air remained freezing. Miller loaded shell after shell. 17 rounds fired. 23, 31. The rhythm of war took over. He pulled a shell, rammed it in, locked the breech, tapped the gunner, then prepared the next. By 1500 hours, the American infantry and the tanks reached the eastern outskirts of Stumont. Ahead, on a steep hill, stood St. Edward's Sanatorium, a massive brick structure that dominated the battlefield. Whoever held that building would control the entire area. The American soldiers secured Tognon by early afternoon, yet the battle only tightened as they moved towards Stumont. Miller's Sherman remained behind a stone barn, providing steady covering fire whenever riflemen pushed forward. High explosive shells thundered into German-held buildings. The interior of the tank grew unbearably hot, even though winter cold still ruled the valley. Miller felt sweat freeze on his neck each time he opened the breech to load another round. He kept going, shell after shell, a rhythm of steel and smoke. The loader's world shrank into a single loop. Pull around, ram it home, lock the breech, tap the shoulder, brace for recoil, then repeat before the ringing in his ears even faded. By 1500 hours, American infantry and the Shermans reached the eastern edge of Stumont. Ahead of them rose the great brick shape of St. Edward's Sanatorium. The building stood 3 stories tall with thick walls and narrow windows that overlooked the valley like fortress slits. It sat on the side of a steep hill, giving whoever held it unmatched control over surrounding fields. The Americans quickly recognized the danger. Piper recognized it as well. That night the Germans launched their most determined counterattack yet. At 2300 hours, between 50 and 100 SS Panzer Grenadiers stormed up the slope toward the sanatorium. Many advanced shouting like men possessed. Others crawled forward before firing Panzerfausts at point-blank range. Inside the building, American defenders fought back desperately. Explosions rocked the walls. Floors shook under the shock waves. German troops surged in through broken windows and blasted doorways. The defenders fell back room by room until the pressure became too fierce. Just after midnight, the Americans were forced out of the sanatorium and down the hillside into the dark. Miller's Sherman sat at the base of the cliffs below St. Edward. The tank could not elevate its main gun high enough to fire into the upper windows. Miller and his crew listened helplessly as fighting raged above them. Automatic weapons rattled, grenades detonated. They heard the screams of men they could not see. The cold air carried every sound like a blade. It felt as if the night would never end. At 0400 on December 21st, another Sherman under 1st Lieutenant David Olinsky crept toward the sanatorium through blackness so thick that even the trees seemed to vanish. According to his driver, what happened next felt like the world splitting open. A hidden German anti-tank gun fired 3 times in rapid succession. Each round penetrated. Flames rose from Olinsky's tank as his crew bailed out. Even as they escaped, 2 German panzers appeared and destroyed 2 more Shermans in barely 30 seconds. 4 tanks burned. Their wrecks blocked the narrow road. Behind them, the rest of the battalion could not advance and could not retreat. The path ahead was choked with flame and twisted steel. Piper controlled Stumont village with more than 50 tanks, and now prepared a major counterattack to crush the daredevils once and for all. At dawn, Lieutenant Colonel Rubel surveyed the scene and understood the crisis. A mountain of obstacles stood between his battalion and the objective. 4 destroyed Shermans clogged the only road. The sanatorium loomed under SS control. Its windows waited like dark eyes ready to fire into any approach. Piper's armor lurked ahead, preparing to roll forward with overwhelming numbers. Rubel needed a solution. He needed it immediately. From a hill near Targnon, Rubel spotted a self-propelled 155mm howitzer that had just arrived with division artillery. Without hesitation, he ordered it taken under his command. At 0800, he placed the massive gun on a hillside overlooking the sanatorium. The howitzer crew fired over open sights, meaning they aimed directly at the building rather than using indirect arcs. Each high explosive round tore into the sanatorium with the force of a giant sledgehammer. Brick and dust burst outward, windows shattered, portions of walls collapsed, yet the SS inside refused to surrender. They clung to every floor with stubborn fanaticism. Rubel continued shelling. 50 rounds crashed into the building throughout the morning. Still, the defenders held. Captain Barry watched the destruction and considered another approach entirely. As night fell, he crawled around the entire perimeter of the sanatorium, searching for an angle of attack the Germans would not expect. Near the back, he found a steep stretch of cliff where a narrow supply track might be carved. Using volunteers from Company C, together with infantry engineers, Barry organized the construction of a crude slope made from smashed tree trunks and empty shell crates. The men worked in darkness while a thick smoke screen hid them from enemy eyes. Service company teams risked their lives hauling the 4 burned Shermans out of the road and dragging them downhill. By dawn on December 22nd, Barry had accomplished the impossible. He maneuvered a platoon of Shermans up the improvised track until they sat so close to the sanatorium that they could fire directly through the windows. The tanks opened fire at point-blank range. High explosive rounds blasted into rooms where the SS had positioned themselves. Machine guns swept every opening with relentless bursts. Infantry from the 119th surged forward behind the tanks. They stormed through the front entrance while the Shermans hammered the upper floors. Fire and debris filled the air. The Germans fought hard, but could not withstand the simultaneous assault. By noon, the sanatorium had been retaken. Smoke drifted from broken windows. Splintered beams and shattered brick covered the floors. In the basement, soldiers found nearly 250 civilians, including many children. They had been trapped for 3 days, hiding from the terrible battle above. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Powers and Staff Sergeant Luppy pushed their vehicles toward the village edge and encountered 2 German tanks attempting to hold the line. One was a Panther. The other, shockingly, was a captured American Sherman now in SS service. Both were destroyed in quick succession. With their lost Piper's final defensive barrier in Stumont collapsed, the remaining SS troops fled east in disarray, trying to reach the village of La Glise 2 miles away. But American forces were not far behind. 2nd Battalion of the 119th pressed from one side while Combat Command B of the 3rd Armored Division advanced from the direction of Trois Ponts. The battle for Stumont had cost time and blood, but the German spearhead had been broken. The fall of Stumont shook Piper's entire command. His soldiers ran east toward La Glise in small scattered groups, leaving behind weapons, shattered trucks, and wounded comrades who could not escape. The momentum that had carried the SS across the Ardennes was gone. The Americans now pressed from every side. 2nd Battalion of the 119th Infantry advanced steadily across fields and hedgerows, forcing the SS into a narrower pocket. From the north, Combat Command B of the 3rd Armored Division moved down from Trois Ponts, striking at every German position they found. The retreat began to resemble a collapse. By nightfall on December 22nd, American forces had pushed 2,000 yards beyond Stumont and sealed Piper's spearhead inside a tightening ring. For the daredevils, the cost of the last 3 days was heavy but miraculous. They had lost 5 tanks and 6 men wounded, but not a single man killed. 1st Battalion of the 119th Infantry had suffered 106 casualties, including 18 killed, 60 wounded, and 28 missing. Yet despite the bloodshed, Piper's drive toward the Meuse had been severed for good. His only hope now lay in reaching La Glise and holding a small perimeter long enough for fuel and ammunition to arrive. Without that resupply, his tanks were nothing more than steel statues trapped in the Belgian snow. Early on December 23rd, the Americans prepared their next advance. Task Force, Harrison prepared to assault La Glise, where Piper had collected the remainder of his armored force. Harry Miller had been reassigned 2 days earlier from his Sherman crew to the assault gun platoon, which operated 6 Shermans equipped with 105mm howitzers rather than the standard 75mm guns. These larger guns were not meant for tank duels. They were designed to fire heavy shells in support of infantry. Miller quickly discovered that loading the 105mm rounds required far more strength. The shells were large, awkward, and heavy. His arms burned with every lift, yet he worked with the focus of a man who understood that speed meant survival. At 900 hours, Miller's assault gun and the 5 others began their slow advance down a road lined with dense woods and open fields. Their target was Chateau Frey, which stood on the eastern edge of Stoumont. Beyond the chateau, less than 2 miles away, the Germans gathered around L'Église, desperately preparing new defensive positions. Lieutenant Colonel Rubel placed himself atop the stone wall of the chateau, like an artillery-forward observer. From that high point, he could see the shape of L'Église rising from the mist. Every few minutes, German shells struck the far side of the valley. Smoke rose above rooftops. Hidden guns barked from tree lines. Rubel remained calm and focused. A few minutes after arrival, Rubel spotted an artillery crew hauling a 155mm cannon toward the east. Without hesitation, he ordered them to stop and set it up behind the chateau. The gunners obeyed at once. Rubel then directed both the 6 assault guns and the massive 155mm weapon, calling out corrections after each shot flew. Fire 100 yards left. Now adjust 2 degrees higher. Fire again. Miller could not see the targets because the chateau blocked the entire view ahead. He only heard thunderous blasts from their own gun and distant eruptions from the shells landing in L'Église. Occasionally he saw the church steeple rise above the trees, then vanish in smoke. The noise felt endless. Every shot shook the earth. His ears rang so fiercely that he could barely hear the intercom inside the tank. Still, he passed shells as fast as he could. The gunner fired without pause, the turret filled with burnt powder smoke. The bombardment lasted more than an hour. Shell after shell walked across the German positions. Rubel aimed to break their strength before the infantry closed in. Miller lost all sense of time. Only the rhythm remained. Lift the shell, pass it forward, brace for recoil. Sweat mixed with powder dust until it coated his sleeves like dark grit. Outside the tank, the forest shook with every blast. Snow slid from branches. The air filled with the smell of cordite and damp soil. And somewhere in the smoke and ruin, Piper realized that his situation had crumbled beyond repair. That night, Piper sat inside the basement of his headquarters in L'Église, surrounded by exhausted men and fading radio batteries. Artillery shells crashed above the structure, making dust drift from the ceiling. He had started the offensive 9 days earlier with 5,800 men and 58 tanks. Now he commanded only 800 men and 28 panzers. He had no fuel. Ammunition dwindled with each battle. His supply lines had been cut. American forces closed around him on 3 sides. The 119th Infantry held the west. The 3rd Armored Division pushed from the north. Paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne held positions across the Ambelve at Chenu to the south. Artillery units had fired more than 57,000 shells into L'Église in only 4 days. Fires raged through the streets. Bodies of SS soldiers lay frozen where they had fallen. There was no hope of breaking out with tanks. There was no hope of holding the village. At 2200 hours on December 23rd, Piper accepted the truth he had tried to avoid. He ordered his men to destroy all remaining equipment and abandon every tank. They would escape on foot in small groups under cover of darkness. The announcement stunned his troops. For days they had fought to advance deeper into Allied territory. They had massacred prisoners. They had burned villages. They had believed they were unstoppable. Now they had been ordered to run as foot soldiers, leaving their prized tanks behind. Some wept, some broke into curses. Others sat in silence, staring at the floor. Before dawn, on December 24th, Battle Group Piper melted into the forest on foot. They left behind 28 heavy tanks, including Panthers, Tigers, and King Tigers. They abandoned 70 half-tracks, 8 armored cars, and numerous artillery pieces. More than 4,000 dead, wounded, or captured soldiers remained behind. Only 800 survivors eventually reached German lines. The elite spearhead that had once terrified entire divisions had been crushed by determined American resistance at Stoumont and La Gleize. On December 24th, Miller entered La Gleize with other American soldiers. The village looked like a place torn apart by giants. Roofs lay broken, walls were shattered, smoke drifted from windows. Bodies lay in rubble-filled streets. Panther tanks and Tiger tanks sat twisted and burnt. A few civilians emerged from cellars with haunted eyes. The church steeple still stood, but it bore dozens of holes from artillery fragments. This was the end of Piper's Drive, and the end of one of the most intense battles Miller would ever witness. When Miller stepped into La Gleize on December 24th, the world around him felt silent in a way that only follows monstrous violence. The only movement came from 2 American tankers refueling a Sherman near the shattered city hall. Their engine rumbled softly like a tired animal resting after a long hunt. A few civilians crawled out from cellars where they had hidden for days. Their faces looked pale and hollow in the winter light. Everything else was ruined. Buildings had holes blasted through them. Doors were torn from hinges. Blackened beams jutted from piles of rubble. Several Tiger tanks and Panthers lay twisted in the streets where American shells had caught them. Smoke trickled from the remains of their turrets like breath from fallen beasts. The battle had ended for now, but the cost lay everywhere around them. The 740th Tank Battalion did not receive rest after the fall of La Gleize. On December 29th, they were attached to the 82nd Airborne Division for operations north of the Bulge salient. The weather remained brutal. Snow fell so often that soldiers felt as if the sky wanted to bury them where they stood. The cold seeped into metal until every bolt and handle felt like ice shaped into a weapon against the human hand. Miller lived inside his Sherman for weeks at a time. Sleep came only when he curled into the loader position with his helmet pressing against the wall. His breath hung inside the turret like thin mist. He ate K-rations so frozen that he had to hold them against the warm engine block just to bite into them. Despite the misery, the daredevils worked well with the elite paratroopers of the 82nd. One airborne soldier later said the 740th was the only tank outfit that could keep pace with infantry known for moving fast and striking even faster. The tankers rarely stopped. When the infantry pushed forward, the Shermans followed. When the infantry stalled, the Shermans went ahead to break enemy lines. The crews grew leaner and harder with every mile. Their uniforms smelled of burnt powder, oil, and sweat. Their ears rang constantly from the thunder of shells. January of 1945 brought new missions without pause. The battalion supported the 8th Infantry Division, then the 63rd, then the 86th. But unlike the infantry, the daredevils almost never rotated into reserve positions. They only stopped long enough for maintenance and supplies. Some days that meant fixing broken tracks in freezing mud. Some days it meant hammering loose armor plates back into place. Then they moved again. Always forward, always toward another village, another ridge, another battle. Miller learned to sleep while the tank rolled across rutted roads. He learned to eat while artillery pounded nearby. He learned to load the 105mm gun at a speed that surprised even experienced gunners. His hands grew calloused and strong. His arms shook after long engagements, but he always reached for the next shell. The work kept him alive. Thinking too hard on death would not. By March 30, the battalion loaded onto trains moving north toward Bonn. Their orders were to help the 8th Infantry Division seal the Ruhr pocket. To reach the 8th, they needed to cross the Rhine River on a pontoon bridge. Miller did not trust the floating platforms. As the Sherman rolled onto the bridge, the planks dipped under its weight. The river surged beneath them. Every time a vehicle ahead dropped between pontoons, Miller feared the next rise in the platform might not come. But the tank reached the far side. The bridge groaned but held. It reminded Miller that the war, even in its final months, remained a place where death could arrive from the smallest mistake. Once across the Rhine, the battalion rejoined the offensive. In early April, they moved into the Ruhr pocket, where fighting grew intense. During one advance, the tankers approached a German airfield where Luftwaffe aircraft were preparing for takeoff. Engines roared. Pilots sprinted toward wings still wet with morning frost. Without hesitation, Miller's assault gun and others in the platoon opened fire. High explosive shells tracked the aircraft as they rolled onto the runway. Several planes burst into flames before lifting off. A few managed to rise into the air only to be shot down moments later by relentless fire. It was a one-sided slaughter. German air power in that sector died in minutes. By mid-April 1945, Allied forces had Germany surrounded. Soviet armies approached Berlin from the east. American and British forces pressed from the west. The Wehrmacht was breaking apart. Yet isolated pockets of resistance still fought with desperate fury. The 740th Tank Battalion advanced through these final battles like a blade cutting through thick brush. Miller had been in combat for 120 days without rest. He had fired thousands of rounds. He had seen more destroyed towns than he could count. He had watched German tanks light the horizon with flame, and he had watched German soldiers surrender in long lines with hollow eyes. The fear he felt at Stoumont Station had changed into something else entirely. Not numbness, not apathy. Instead, it became a cold, steady focus. Load the shell, ram it home, lock the breech, tap the shoulder. Fire, repeat. The rhythm kept him alive. His mind learned not to wander. His hands moved even when he felt too tired to stand. On April 30th, the Daredevils crossed the Elbe River at Bleckede. This time the crossing was unopposed. German forces in that region had collapsed entirely. Beyond the river lay the Baltic coast and the territory where the British Second Army advanced. The 740th continued north and eventually linked up with British forces near Schwerin. The war was almost over. Men spoke about home. Some allowed themselves to imagine warm beds and quiet streets. Others refused to think beyond the next sunrise. On May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe ended. That afternoon, Miller sat on the turret of his Sherman staring at the sky. He tried to understand the moment. 138 days earlier, his battalion had possessed no operational tanks. Now they sat at the Baltic Sea after fighting across an entire nation. He had survived while so many others had not. His hearing was damaged. His muscles ached. His hands bore scars from days and nights of loading shells. But he was alive. The final record of the 740th Tank Battalion told a story almost unbelievable in its scale. 43 men had been killed in action. 57 Shermans had been lost. Yet the battalion had destroyed 69 enemy tanks, including 17 Tigers and King Tigers. They had smashed or captured 717 enemy vehicles. They had eliminated 264 enemy aircraft, most of them destroyed on the ground. They had breached the Siegfried Line twice while serving under 2 different armies. And above all, they had stopped Battle Group Piper when the situation had been most desperate. Captain Barry received a Silver Star for his actions at Stoumont. Lieutenant Powers received one as well. Staff Sergeant Luppy earned the same honor. The Daredevils had carved their story into the frozen ground of Belgium and the shattered fields of Germany. Every tanker who had fought at Stoumont received a Presidential Unit citation. The official statement described how the battalion halted the furthest German advance during the Battle of the Bulge using hastily assembled vehicles and unmatched courage. It recognized an achievement that should have been impossible. Yet Miller received no individual medals. He was simply a private first class in an assault gun platoon, one man among 800, a loader who had done his job without hesitation. But he had been present on December 19th when 3 junkyard Shermans faced the strongest armored force in the SS. He had loaded shells during the frantic fighting, while Lieutenant Colonel Rubel stood on top of Chateau Frey directing fire like a conductor leading a violent symphony. He had crossed the Rhine River on a floating bridge that groaned beneath the weight of steel. He had crossed the Elbe River during the war's final days. He had done everything required of him. He had done it when his country needed it most. After Germany surrendered, the 740th remained in Europe for occupation duty. Soldiers shifted into a different rhythm. No more frantic advances. No more artillery pounding the sky. Instead, they guarded roads and bridges and supply depots. They maintained order in shattered towns where civilians struggled to rebuild their lives brick by brick. Miller stayed with the battalion through 1945 until he finally transferred back to the United States in June of that year. Civilian life felt strange after 138 days of continuous combat. Yet Miller adapted. He always adapted. Not long after returning home, he re-enlisted and served in Korea with General MacArthur's headquarters in the Communications Center. His work involved secure messages and coordination efforts. It demanded discipline and clarity. Miller excelled in those tasks just as he had inside the turret of a Sherman. When the Korean War ended, he joined the Air Force and found himself working in Strategic Air Command during the Vietnam era. There he handled codes and cryptologic assignments that supported major operations, including bombing missions carried out under secrecy. The work was tense but vital. Miller remained steady in every posting. He retired in January of 1966 as a senior master sergeant after 22 years of service to his country. For decades, the story of the 740th Tank Battalion remained mostly unknown. Histories of the Battle of the Bulge focused on Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division had held out against overwhelming odds. Patton's Third Army burst through the German lines to rescue them. That narrative became legend. Entire books and films were devoted to it. Meanwhile, Stoumont received only passing mention. Yet Stoumont was where Piper's armored spearhead had been shattered, where 3 scrapyard Shermans stood against Panthers and lived, where a tiny battalion with almost no resources had stopped an SS formation with brutal efficiency. It was a victory won through grit rather than glory. In 1998, veterans of the battalion funded a memorial in Baus, Arizona, where the daredevils had trained in harsh desert heat before facing Belgian snow. A simple marker stood on the training grounds listing the battalion's history and honoring all who served. The following year, in 1999, the Belgian town of Neufchâteau dedicated another monument. This one held all 800 names of the men who had served in the 740th. A few surviving veterans attended the ceremony, many already in their 70s and 80s. They walked with careful steps, some used canes, some wore their old unit patches with pride. Within another decade, only 6 veterans attended annual reunions. Time thinned their ranks more effectively than any battlefield. After leaving the Air Force, Miller built a quiet life. He worked as a private investigator in New Mexico, using the same sharp focus he had carried since the war. Later, he became Director of Security at St. Vincent Hospital, then worked as a safety inspector at the University of Texas in Arlington. He retired again in 1989. At age 69, he discovered a new passion: jazz and swing drumming. He practiced for hours each week until he could keep rhythm with local bands in Seattle, Washington. Music softened the hard edges of memory. Drums became a way to speak without words about things he seldom discussed. Like many veterans of the 740th, Miller rarely spoke of the war. Those who fought together often carried a shared silence. They came home, they built families, they worked ordinary jobs. The battles they survived remained chapters locked inside their minds. They remembered comrades who never returned. They remembered cold nights and burning tanks and winter fog tinted red by tracer fire. Those memories belonged to them. They did not place them on display. When Miller's wife Helen passed away after 37 years of marriage, he moved to the Armed Forces Retirement Home in Washington District of Columbia. There he occasionally met other veterans from different war eras. Sometimes they exchanged stories. Sometimes they simply shared quiet nods of understanding. Some men needed to remember. Others preferred not to speak. Miller balanced somewhere between those worlds. In 2006, Paul Pearson, who had served as a tank commander in Company C, published a memoir titled Into the Breach. Pearson had kept detailed notes during the war. After retiring, he spent years studying unit records and interviewing surviving veterans. His book became one of the few complete chronicles of an independent tank battalion in the European theater. It described every hardship, every advance, every shattered village, and every burning tank. It honored the men who had fought with him, and those who had fallen. Through Pearson's writing, the story of the daredevils found its way into the hands of people who had never heard it before. The story of the 740th revealed an important truth about war. History often celebrates dramatic last stands and heroic rescues, yet countless smaller actions shaped the outcome of a conflict. At Stumont, a tiny group of American tankers using barely repaired vehicles stopped an elite SS formation. If Piper had reached the Meuse River, the Allied armies would have been split. The war might have dragged on for months, but 3 Shermans assembled in one night halted the advance at the exact moment when everything depended on them. The Sherman tank itself symbolized another truth. It was not the most powerful tank on the battlefield. Panthers carried heavier guns, Tigers had thicker armor, yet the United States built Shermans in staggering numbers. They built them with standard parts easy to repair in the field. A tank destroyed in the morning could be replaced by evening, and a tank abandoned in a depot could be revived by a few determined mechanics and a handful of scavenged components. The German tanks were masterpieces of engineering but required constant maintenance and vast fuel supplies. When Piper's fuel ran out, his tanks became steel monuments to failure. The Battle of the Bulge cost the United States 89,000 casualties out of 610,000 men who fought there. German losses exceeded 100,000. The offensive exhausted Germany's remaining strength. It was their last attempt to turn the tide. Stumont formed one of the points where the tide turned back forever. The Battle of the Bulge remained the largest and bloodiest fight the United States faced in the Second World War. More than 89,000 American soldiers became casualties out of 610,000 engaged. German losses rose even higher, with over 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The Ardennes offensive drained the last strategic reserves Germany possessed. After its failure, the Wehrmacht could no longer mount an operation of similar scale anywhere on the continent. The fate of Kampfgruppe Piper reflected this collapse with brutal clarity. The SS formation had begun the offensive on December 16th with 5,800 men and 58 tanks. By the time they fled La Gleize on December 24th, only 800 remained able to escape on foot. More than 4,000 were dead, wounded, or taken prisoner in 8 days of combat. The unit never reformed. Its survivors scattered among other SS groups. Piper himself lived through the war, though he carried the stain of the Malmedy massacre for the rest of his life. In 1976, he was murdered in France by unknown attackers possibly seeking vengeance. His life ended in the shadows just as his command had ended in fire. The 740th Tank Battalion left behind few surviving vehicles. Most of the Shermans that had been repaired at Spremont Depot were scrapped after the war. A handful were preserved in military collections, but many vanished into scrapyards where their steel was melted and repurposed. A modest display at Fort Knox, Kentucky, honored the battalion's service. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans included a few references to independent tank battalions like the Daredevils, but physical artifacts from the unit remained rare. Time consumed metal as easily as memory. In 2016, Harry Miller visited the National World War II Memorial in Washington District of Columbia. He traveled with Harold Bradley, another veteran of the 740th. Both men were in their late 80s. The Honor Flight Network arranged the journey to give aging veterans a chance to see the monument built in their honor. Miller stood before the stone pillars and the long rolls of engraved names. The water in the fountains shimmered with winter light. People walked quietly around him. Yet for Miller, the moment felt personal. He scanned the names and thought about the tankers who had not lived long enough to stand there beside him. He thought about men who had died in Belgium under burning Panthers. He thought about the infantry who had fallen at Stumont Station and on the slopes below St. Edward Sanatorium. The memorial was carved in granite, yet to Miller the memories remained carved in something far more fragile. The human heart. During his final years, Miller gave several interviews to Army historians. He described rebuilding tanks from wreckage at Spremont. He described loading shells during the 30-minute battle at Stumont Station. He described the long months of fighting across Germany. When asked what he felt about his service, he answered with steady certainty. He said he was proud of everything he had done. He said if he had the chance, he would do it all over again. He encouraged younger soldiers to remain in uniform and retire with benefits that would support them later in life. He spoke plainly without seeking praise. He simply believed in doing one's duty. Miller passed away in the year 2017 at the age of 89. He had served across 3 wars, dedicated 22 years to his country, and lived long enough to watch the world he helped defend grow into something larger than he could have imagined as a young loader crouched inside a cold Sherman. His life became a quiet testament to resilience and purpose. He carried memories of violence and loss, but he also carried the satisfaction of having stood firm when history demanded it. The 740th Tank Battalion was officially deactivated on July 23rd of 1946. 13 of its members had given their lives during the war, yet the battalion's operational record surpassed that of many larger units. They fought in the Ardennes-Alsace campaign, the Rhineland campaign, and the Central Europe campaign. They served under the 1st, 3rd, 7th, and 9th United States Armies, as well as the 1st Allied Airborne Army and the British 2nd Army. Few independent tank battalions matched the range of assignments or the intensity of combat the Daredevils encountered. Today, a memorial stands in Baus, Arizona, where the battalion once trained under the hot desert sun in 1943 and 1944. The monument lists the battalion's campaigns and honors all who served. Veterans donated it in 1998, determined that the memory of their unit would not fade. The site is remote. Few visitors travel through that patch of desert, yet the monument remains. It stands quiet and steady like the men it honors. A marker built not for crowds but for remembrance. A second monument rests in Neuchâtel, Belgium. It was dedicated on April 24, 1999. On it are engraved the names of every man who served in the 740th Tank Battalion. Many Belgian citizens attended the ceremony to show gratitude for the liberation of their towns. They remembered the winter when German armor rolled through their streets. They remembered the sudden roar of American Shermans returning fire. They remembered how the 740th helped drive the SS out of Stumont, and how 3 hastily repaired Shermans stopped an assault that could have changed the fate of the entire Ardennes campaign. These monuments stand not only for the dead but for the living. They stand for men like Miller who returned home and built new lives. They stand for the tank crews who loaded shells in freezing turrets, for the mechanics who repaired vehicles using scraps of broken machines, for the infantry who dug foxholes into frozen soil and held ground inch by inch, for the artillerymen who fired 57,000 shells into L'Église, for the medics who carried wounded across snowy fields, for the cooks and drivers and clerks who kept an army moving through winter and war. The memory of the Daredevils remains alive because stories survive. Stories held by veterans, stories published by historians, stories told by families. In the grand scale of the Second World War, Stumont may appear small, yet its impact was enormous. If Piper had reached the Meuse River, the Allied lines might have been torn apart. The war might have continued for months more. But 3 Shermans resurrected from a depot yard stopped the advance in 30 minutes, and the fate of the offensive shifted. Every battlefield has a turning point. For the Ardennes, that turning point lay in the fog near Stumont Station, where a young loader named Harry Miller gripped cold steel and loaded shells into a tank built from scraps. His hands helped shape the outcome of a war. His courage helped hold the line long enough for victory to take root. The daredevils of the 740th fought with everything they had. Their story endures because it deserves to be remembered. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.